All right, up next, we have two representatives from the Washington State Department of Agriculture. I'm pleased to introduce Erin Coyle and Randy Treadwell. And which one of you is going to be sharing the PowerPoint?
I will be sharing, Alexis.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, take it away.
Great.
Okay,
Thank
great.
You.
Well, go ahead, Erin.
No, I was just, go ahead and introduce us, Randy. Just going to get the slideshow started.
Great. Sounds good. All right. Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to have us. As Alexis mentioned, my name is Randy Treadwell. I'm the Program Manager at the Washington State Department of Agriculture Rapid Response and Emergency Management Program. You'll be hearing shortly from our Emergency Management Specialist, Erin Coyle, on a couple of slides, and our plan is to kind of pinch hit through this presentation, talking a little bit about Incident Command System, or ICS, and our experience, our personal experience on implementing ICS for various responses, be it planned or unexpected, and having to be all hazards, whether it be natural disaster, wildfire related, outbreak response related, etc. So our goal in the next few minutes here is to work through these slides and give you a taste of how we implement ICS from our perspective, give an overview of what it is, how it works as a coordination tool. Like I said, lessons learned about what we've come across using ICS, some benefits, some potential challenges as we work through that, and things to consider if ICS can be a helpful tool for you in your jurisdictions and in your groups. So with that, I see the power presentation is up. I will turn it over to Erin to talk a little bit about objectives. Erin?
Thanks, Randy. So as Randy touched on, we are going to just provide a high-level overview of emergency management in Washington and what does that look like as a state agency, touch on Incident Command System, or what we'll refer to from now on as ICS. The key component, I think, about ICS would be scalability, and we'll dive into that pretty well, as well as long-term monitoring, control versus immediate coordination and containment. As Sven touched on earlier in today, things might not always work long-term for a insect pest as it relates to ICS, and we do want to underscore scalability and flexibility. And then, again, filling a subject matter expert position as technical specialist, and this is incredibly important, especially for this audience. Okay, so generally in Washington, we are a home rule state, and this means that the responsibility for an emergency response starts at the most local form of government. Typically, that would be the county government responding, and when the state gets involved is when the local resources have been exceeded, and then they formally request that support from the state. And this we can see often in any sort of all hazards response. There is an exception to this, and that's often when a federal agency has jurisdiction. A foreign animal disease would be a good example of this, or if an investigation is involving the FBI. And it's not a perfect one-fit scenario for every single incident or disaster emergency that comes across, but we do try to respect this general framework of a home rule in Washington State. And as it relates to WSDA's role in the state response system for emergency management, we follow the State Comprehensive Emergency Management Plan, and under that we have Emergency Support Function 11, and WSDA is the lead agency coordinating the responsibilities under that support function. And it's just kind of our playbook of how we play with others during an incident if that support function is activated at the State Emergency Operations Center. And specific for this group, we do touch on Appendix 2, which would be the State Animal Health Response Plan, which would be applicable perhaps during a feral swine incident within Washington State. And also there is Appendix 3, where is the State Plant Health Response Plan. So some current responses and recent responses in Washington, not stating the obvious, but Washington WSDA has been involved with gypsy moth for quite some time, and then the Asian giant hornet. Pivoting away from WSDA specific responses, we have also been involved with an interstate multi-federal agency coordination for the 2020 wildfire season, as well as COVID-19, and ESF 11 remains activated, coordinating our responsibilities to the state and citizens for those two incidences. So in Washington State, there is the RCW 3852 that does mandate the use of the standardized ICS in all multi-agency, which would be federal, state, local, or multi-jurisdictional incidences and emergencies. And Randy will dive into this of why this is important, but it comes back down to we don't always have the same day in and day out language that we use. Each agency operates slightly different from a state standpoint, from a federal standpoint, from county or local standpoint. ICS is that shared language that we can all speak rapidly in a chaotic scenario, so we are all operating off of the same sheet of music. Okay, Randy?
Great. Thanks, Erin, for giving us that overview of the emergency support function and support throughout Washington State and how we play a role in it. So what exactly is ICS? I know there's a lot of trainings out there. There's a lot of resources, and we actually have some resources that we'll touch upon later in the presentation if you guys are interested in perusing on your own time. But we did want to just give you a real brief overview of, like I said, what ICS is and what our experience is with it with specific examples. So pretty much, as you can see on your screen, ICS is a standardized, on-scene, all-hazards incident management concept. It's all about management and coordination. And it allows users to adopt an organized structure, a standardized structure to meet whatever they're trying to deal with, whatever they're trying to coordinate and manage. And that can vary in complexity, it can vary in scope, it can vary in region or numbers of stakeholders. The thing is, and Erin mentioned it, we'll touch upon it here in a little bit, is that ICS is scalable and ICS is flexible. So one of the challenges that we've had when we initially implemented ICS within the agency for food and animal feed emergency response and outbreaks was the challenge of, well, it's just so rigorous. How do we, why would we put in so much time to implement ICS when we know what we're doing? It's our wheelhouse. We've been doing it for 20 years. Why would we do something different? And two, this just seems like a lot of extra paperwork in the early stages and a lot of extra structure when we already know what we're doing. Why would we do this? And so one thing that we've really tried to educate folks on is that it's scalable, meaning that large incidents or small incidents, you can adjust how much structure is around those responses in order to meet your needs. If you don't need a logistics section to order supplies and track supplies, you don't need to have it. And we'll give some examples of both large structures and smaller structures as we move forward here in these slides. But that's one of our key tenets that we wanted to make sure and share with folks today, that it's flexible and you make it do what you need to do to meet your needs. So ICS, just as kind of a little bit of a history lesson, it started back in the 1970s formally in California due to the particularly terrible fire season that year, and a lot of unfortunate casualties, deaths, and property loss because of those fires. And when they put together the after-action review and the subsequent report that came out of that, a lot of the things that were identified were lack of common terminology amongst all of the responders to the fire incident. Operational procedures were either not known by everyone or not standardized across the large-scale response. And then resource allocation was also a challenge. How do we get certain resources? Who's managing them? How do we return them? Just the logistics around those resources. And resources can also include people, the personnel component. So there was a lot of lessons learned out of that. And of course, that was a fire situation, but they created it to be all hazards, meaning that it can be fire to gypsy moth to foodborne illness outbreaks to what have you. So the scale is appropriate and it's standardized across whatever you're doing. So a little bit of a history lesson on on why ICS came to terms, at least in the United States. And you'll see as well that a lot of the components have a pretty good, pretty solid military background as well, as far as chain of command, span of control, and things like that we'll define in a couple slides. So you'll see right here who does what, right? So the incident command system, as it stands, is combined into two kind of areas. You'll see here as a command staff, which is usually the incident commander, or if you have lots of stakeholders involved, it could be incident commanders from several agencies. We do that a lot, for example, in FDA without foodborne outbreaks, where both Department of Agriculture, Department of Health, and sometimes FDA will be in unified command, meaning they all have leaders who are at this command level, help guiding policy and intent for the response. We heard Sven mention a little bit earlier that for this last go around with the incident command posts, they had it virtual, which is fantastic. And that's, again, a point of flexibility where, you know, if this structure isn't working for you in a physical environment, there's ways to flex it to meet your needs. So you'll see here that there's a few positions, incident, the command group, which includes liaisons to other agencies, maybe a public information officer. We also heard earlier about coordinating standard factual messages out through social media, et cetera, public information officers, or if you have more than one agency, a joint information center or a JIC, to where lots of people, lots of PIOs come together to make sure standardized messaging is there across the entire response. You'll see that here noted in the structure, as well as safety officers. Particularly for eradication type situations, there might be some safety considerations for staff who are implementing it. So, and then down below you'll see a sampling of what we call the general staff, meaning operations, or the doers, the people actually on the ground getting stuff done, boots on the ground. You'll see planning, who are just that, the planners. They're planning out and figuring out what they need to do for the next go around or operational period. The logistics are the getters. Yeah, they hear from the staff that they need out in the field, that they need additional equipment, additional support. The logistics folks are what get those items. And then finance admin are the trackers, figuring out how much budget, how much time for staff is needed, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a very high level view of an ICS structure. Now you'll see here, I mentioned earlier that people get bogged down a lot and think, oh my gosh, this is a lot of potentially extra structure around this when we already know what we're doing. Why do we need this? I will say that the thing that you're looking at in front of you right now is a very, very large example of a response. For example, with foodborne illness outbreaks, sometimes, let's say, a positive pathogen hit on a retail raw milk sample that we would collect through the agency, we, at maximum, will typically have an incident commander, one field person, and one planning person. So that's about 3. We'll keep more people involved for situational awareness, but when it comes to this actual structure, it's much more scaled down and boiled because that works for us. And because we've been doing it for a while, we know what we need to do, and that works for us. So again, the piece of scalability and flexibility. Next slide. So how and when would I use ICS? And Erin and I, not necessarily being native to the weed and invasive species world, wanted to kind of think about how this might apply particularly to this audience. And again, not all invasive species response actions would necessarily require ICS unless you'd like to do that. Again, this is your guys' wheelhouse. You know what you're doing. But there are certain situations to where you might want to consider using ICS, including, you'll see here on the bullet points, things where you have a lot of different jurisdictions, whether it be multi-state, including a lot of our tribal partners on tribal land, federal jurisdictions, et cetera. Also situations where resources might, where beyond those available for within Department of Agriculture or within your particular group, where you need to coordinate resource allocation, people, equipment, supplies, et cetera, outside of your normal wheelhouse. Sometimes ICS helps coordinate that. And then I mentioned the whole public sharing, public information piece. If there's a lot of stakeholders, a lot of interest from the public or political interest, that multi-stakeholder approach and making sure that factual information gets out in a timely and effective manner sometimes can be coordinated through ICS and through that joint information center I mentioned earlier. So again, it boils down to the size of the incident, the complexity of the incident, and making it work for you. Next slide. So talking a little bit more about scalability and flexibility. As you guys are more than aware, it's going to depend on the organism that you're looking at. It's going to depend on the area. Using eradication, gypsy moth eradication as an example, looking at the region that you're planning on doing flyovers for eradication and spraying, the needs of a particular response. All of that is going to depend on how you structure all of this. And again, it's up to you. And we're going to give a smaller example here in a second. But again, just harping on the point that it can be scaled appropriately for the response, and don't be scared away by having these large structures when it really wouldn't be working for you. Next slide. So Erin mentioned that we at WSDA, as far as Emergency Support Function 11, which is Agricultural and Natural Resources, we've been dual activated for quite some time. Late January for COVID-19, and we're still activated for that. And then late summer for the 2020 wildfire season. And this is just an example of the organizational chart that we have through the State Emergency Operations Center for that dual activation. And we realize it's a little bit small. The details aren't necessarily of note, but you'll see that this is a dual activation for relatively large responses, and it's scalable to the point of what we needed at the time for state response. So as you see, obviously there's a lot of federal agencies involved, the governor's office, rightly so, all feeding into the SEOC, which is a coordination body. We always like to remind people of that. It's not a command and control type situation. It's coordinating resources and information. But all that goes down to boots on the ground. You'll see on the left-hand side there, down under the operations section, is all of our emergency support functions, which are us in agriculture with 11, but everybody else, including telecommunications and public health with Department of Health and National Guard under ESF 20. So there's a lot of physical people within this structure, because it has to be because of the scope of these particular responses. But again, number of people and number of little boxes you're fitting them into can scale to your needs. Next slide. So again, just as an example of the 2009 Gypsy Moth org chart, and you'll see part of the deal with Incident Command System as part of that standardization is keeping it all on standardized forms too, so people know what they're looking at and where to find information as new updates come out. So you'll see, as an example here in 2019, we used the form 207, which is, again, standardized chart, or a form that where you can put your incident organization chart. So again, scalable to meet your needs, and people know where to get the information because it's on standardized format. Okay, next slide. So talking a little bit about chain of command, there's a lot of kind of basic tenets to incident command, and this is not meant to be an exhaustive training on ICS. There's a lot of other resources, including Department of Homeland Security and FEMA, that have a really great resource online for online training for particularly introductory incident command courses, and we'll have some links to that later in the presentation. But we're just wanting to hit upon a couple very high-level foundations of ICS that we felt was appropriate for a taste of ICS and for this audience. So one thing to hit on is chain of command, and obviously organization is important. And what is chain of command? It pretty much breaks it down to that you have one supervisor as anywhere in this particular chart that you're thinking is ICS, and you're formally sharing information with your supervisor up the chain of command, right? So same thing is present in military, same things in law enforcement, in emergency response, and what have you. So the key here is that it brings an orderly line of authority. And one key thing too is that there's a lot of players usually in these types of situations where you know, in the heat of the moment might not necessarily think to include someone. This chain of command helps keep structure on that and allows everybody to keep aware of the situation and of the information that they need to move forward and make decisions. So as you guys all know, when you get more than a couple people in a room working on the same thing, herding cats is a really challenging business. So creating some sort of structure to that is always, at least in our experience, very, very helpful. One thing that we do want to note here is that chain of command in an ICS structure, you might not always be reporting to your routine supervisor, meaning that the ICS structure might have you be reporting to someone else outside of your daily work. And that sometimes can rub people a little bit differently, and it can sometimes be a learning curve for people, both supervisors and the people who are reporting. So something to keep in mind. Okay, next slide. So span of control, manageability is important as well, right? I mean, you don't want to have a bunch of people reporting to one person and having that person be overwhelmed because they got a lot of other stuff to do. So one of the key points of ICS is making sure that you just kind of keep a mental note of when you're creating that structure that you have enough people in there to where people aren't being overwhelmed and it bogs itself down to where you don't get anything done. So span of control in ICS indicates that it ranges, ideally studies have shown 3 to 7 people being directly reportable to one person, with 5 being the ideal kind of ratio, 1 to 5, 1 supervisor to 5 direct reports. And so that is something that's a tenet of ICS that we try to implement as well. So moving forward, Erin's going to be providing some additional kind of real life examples about ICS at work, both at a national perspective and a little bit closer to home. So I will turn it over to Erin.
Thanks, Randy. And so as we talked about, ICS helps often when we are dealing with multi-jurisdictional, multi-agency scenarios, be it an immediate emergency or maybe something quite slow and ballooning. But it's helpful when we are all speaking the same language and we have, at least at the initial response, something to drive the direction of the management of a potentially chaotic scenario. One example I kind of pulled from the 100th Meridian Initiative, and for some species, national programs or regional partnerships can provide additional support operations. Those involved in this initiative, as I said earlier, might not always share that same standard organizational structure on a day-to-day basis. And so the ICS organizational structure was adopted as its emergency response structure so that it can help drive any sort of initial response. Only those elements needed might be pulled in to give a support based off of whatever species we are responding to. And this is an example that actually Justin Bush provided, which was very helpful. And this early detection and rapid response best practices was developed, after some research from a student at Western Washington University in partnership with the Washington Invasive Species Council. And there were some 6 key elements that were defined in this for a cohesive operative EDRR plan. And one of those that was also pulled out that could supplement these 6 key elements for an essential cohesive plan was ICS. That ICS could in fact be considered a best practice when we are dealing with invasive species. There's kind of a caveat to that. When we are dealing with an invasive species response, it may only be considered a best practice to use ICS in specific plans that address newly detected invasive species that are considered an emergency, because there's nuances in the whole scope of invasive species. And we understand that, trying to fit a square peg into a round hole might make sense for every single thing that comes across our desk. But for an emergency response scenario, and that would be defined, based off of that jurisdiction or that species or the threat to the economy, that's when ICS could be considered a best practice. Another, example of pulling in ICS as we talk about early detection and rapid responses is when we're dealing again with multi-jurisdictional and multi-agency coordination. And the Forest Service, they have been long coordinating with other federal agencies that began incorporating ICS, basic ICS approaches into the program as they coordinate not just with federal partners, but as they also look to coordinate with state partners. And at home here, we have an example with DFW and WSDA and the Washington Invasive Species Council, as well as USDA Wildlife Services on our interagency feral swine response plan. We built this plan around ICS principles because this would help us respond rapidly to a strong threat, an emergency that would be detected in Washington if we did have feral swine. Randy?
Great, thanks, Erin. In the next couple of slides, because this isn't an exhaustive ICS training, we're going to breeze through pretty quickly, but please just know that there's additional resources out there where you can get more information on this. So we're going to talk a little bit about the planning P, and this is, so we've created an ICS structure for our particular response, which is, could be, like I said, unknown or a planned type situation. Now what do we do with it? How do we actually get work done? And this is the planning process, also affectionately known as the planning P, that establishes the continuum of creating a plan to implement. So each one of these little boxes is a meeting of sorts or development process of sorts. And one thing that we've seen a lot of is people think, wow, that is a lot of meetings. Like, why do we need to go through this much stuff again when we know what we're doing? And it's really kind of routine for us at this point. We agree that it's tempting to kind of bypass some of these things. But one thing that we've learned as a lessons learned in our responses is that all of this front end work, as far as getting an instant action plan, making sure that people are on the same page early on, really helps with the concerns and the time sucks later down in the road, where you're answering the phone call every minute and you're answering the same question to 20 different people. Our experience is if you can get all of this and everybody on the same page very early on with this meeting cycle, it really helps cut down that busy work in the end and really helps the response run a lot smoother as time goes on. Next slide. And just as an example, here's an initial planning meeting. Again, it encourages communication. It brings the appropriate partners together and really outlines the activities that you're planning on doing. Again, this can be for something that can be really quickly, kind of in an ad hoc type situation if something happens that you weren't anticipating, or if it's more planned, like for example, gypsy moth eradication, you can sit people down and get a general situational awareness of the plan moving forward. Next slide. Again, this is just an example of a standardized form, the incident briefing, or the ICS 201 form. And we here in Washington, for particularly food and feed response, and I know that pesticide and our pest folks have used it as well, for making sure that people have a general situational awareness of what the plan is and what's been going on as far as updates go. So we find this tool extremely useful and use it almost on a daily basis. Next slide. And Erin.
Thanks, Randy. Yeah. So, and ICS as a tool that can be useful, or pulling out pieces of ICS as their standalone tools to help guide immediate response or a long-term response. Another tool that can be added to that emergency response tool belt is crisis and emergency risk communication. A big component of ICS is clear communication and coordination. When we are dealing with an emergency, that is key. Not only just communicating externally to stakeholders and partners or those impacted, but also those in that initial meeting and leadership notifications. So I did want to highlight, CIRC is not something that is part of ICS, but it is this great system that was developed from the public health community, specifically CDC, to call out 6 key principles of effective crisis and risk communication, of being first, being right, being credible, expressing empathy, and promote action. And this is important, I think, when we are dealing with an emergency response for an invasive species, because there's always going to be that initial communication component to stakeholders and making sure that the right information is being delivered first. But then also we recognize that there's going to be long-term, communication. And in such incidences, a specific 1-800 number can be useful, especially for any species that is something of high concern. And one example I did want to pull out again would be feral swine. There is the Squeal on Pigs hotline and other modes of reporting invasive animals. Not, you could use invasive animals reporting form from Washington Invasive Species Council webpage. And then there's other forms too. So all of these different modes of communication can be directed to that coordinator party or person, and then they can spread out the correct information to all those different multi-agency, multi-jurisdictional persons of contact across federal and state agencies, so that we're all sharing the same operating picture, and we know, in fact, that there has been a confirmed sighting and what would be the appropriate mode to respond. Okay, Randy?
Great, thanks, Erin. So we're going to wrap things up a little bit here, and the one thing that we do want to hit upon, that if you do utilize ICS, when is that, there's always that question of, you saw that cyclical pattern of meetings. How do you get out of that? When you figure out that the incident has been contained, it's been mitigated, eradication has been completed, when does it come back to long-term management? Because obviously we all realize that, you deal with the little fires at hand, the incidents, but there's always that kind of long ongoing management. How do you get back out of ICS into that? So, the key here, you guys can read for yourself, but the key here is that last bullet where those who are in the leadership position in ICS need to always start about getting out of ICS early and demobilization. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Next slide. So demobilization, there's our planning P again. How do you exit that constant roundabout? And again, that last point there, the command staff, the leadership should always be aware that they should be thinking of demobilization and a transition plan from the start of a response. You're never too early to start thinking about demob. The population has been contained, the situation has been stabilized, the spray has been completed, what have you. All kinds of factors need to go into that determination. But ICS, true to its fashion, has standardized processes to think about demobilization as well. So there is a way to get out of it once you get into it. Next slide.
Erin and Randy.
And then finally, thank you, perfect. We are almost done. So when you're all wrapped up and ICS is done and your mission has been accomplished, how do you make sure that you reflect and just don't go on to the next fire? And part of that is the after action report and improvement plan process. So again, structure, standardized structure is ICS. So the facilitated discussion in a structured format, you bring together your responders, whether it be within your agency or as a whole stakeholder group, and you say, this is what we wanted to do. Did we do it? Did we do it well? And what can be improved upon? And all of that discussion quickly after goes into an improvement plan, and where you can start, you don't lose all of that lessons learned for the next iteration. So next slide. Again, this is not a, oh, sorry, Erin, go ahead.
Oh, that's fine, Randy. And so this is, again, probably what Randy was going to say, not a comprehensive list of all the resources that you could tie into for ICS, but the one that you'd want to start with would be that first bullet point, the ICS Resource Center through FEMA. And that's going to highlight all of those independent study courses that you can do online that are all prerequisites to moving on to those in-person or position-specific. Right now, a lot of those position-specific or more complex ICS courses offered through EMD, which you can tie into their calendar, have been suspended due to in-person meetings not really occurring at this point in time. However, they are seeking ways to be creative. So keep staying tuned to see when you might be able to get more ICS training outside of those basic offerings. And then, ICS can be very form heavy. If you are interested in that, you can always dive into looking at what form does what and why. And then if you want to learn more about crisis and emergency risk communication, you can go to the CDC emergency page and learn more about that. And with that, that's our close of our presentation on ICS. I know it wasn't comprehensive training, but we did hope to touch on what was most applicable to invasive species response. And we are both embedded at WSDA. We'd welcome any questions at any point in time. Please take down our contact information, and we'll stay around for any questions at the end of the forum.